This is a story about a father's perfect world shattering in a single phone call. He discovers his beloved daughter is not the person he thought she was. She has built a second life as a criminal mastermind, and the quiet, accomplished young woman he raised is a complete stranger. The trust he built over a lifetime is destroyed in an instant, forcing him to confront a terrifying truth. Friends, tell me where you're from. I'm really interested in where my viewers live. The mail felt heavier that day. It wasn't a physical weight, but a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle premonition that settled in the pit of my stomach as I pulled the stack of envelopes from the box. The afternoon sun was slanting, casting long, lazy shadows across the driveway, the kind of peaceful, ordinary light that makes you believe everything is right with the world. I remember the sound of a lawnmower a few houses down, the scent of cut grass and warm pavement. I remember thinking I needed to water the petunias. Small, simple thoughts for a small, simple life. I sifted through the pile as I walked back to the house. Junk mail with flashy promises, a couple of bills with their familiar, grim windows, a catalog for something Sarah would probably want. And then my thumb brushed against it. A crisp, legal-sized envelope. It was starkly white against the colorful junk, its paper thick and substantial. My name and address were printed in a sharp, professional font, but it was the return address that made me pause. There, embossed in a deep, navy blue, was the name of my lawyer's firm, Harrington and Shaw, LLC. A flicker of confusion. My affairs were in order. The will was updated last year. The house was paid off. There was no pending litigation, no looming business that required legal counsel. It had to be a mistake, some automated thing, a reminder for a review I didn't need. I tore the flap open, the paper resisting for a moment before giving way with a clean tear. There was no covering letter, no explanation. Just a single sheet of his official letterhead, the same embossed logo at the top. And on it, four words were typed, centered on the page as if they were a headline. Call me immediately. I stopped walking. I was standing on a welcome mat, the front door half ajar. The sound of the lawnmower faded into a dull hum. Those four words. It was the exclamation point that did it. Robert Shaw, my lawyer for 20 years, was not a man of exclamation points. He was a man of semicolons and carefully placed clauses. His communications were measured, precise, and utterly devoid of emotional punctuation. A period would have signified a request. This exclamation point was a silent alarm. I could hear Sarah inside. She was on the phone with a friend, her voice a light, melodic stream of laughter and gossip. Oh my God, he did not. No, tell me everything. The normalcy of it, the sheer, beautiful banality, felt like a shield. Behind that door was my world, intact and humming along. In my hand was a piece of paper that felt like a fuse. My mind, that treacherous organ, began its frantic dance. It was probably a billing error. A trust fund disbursement for Sarah had gone awry. Perhaps a distant relative I'd never met had passed away and named me in a will. It had to be something mundane, something that could be fixed with a signature and a phone call. That's what I told myself. But the cold, leaden feeling in my gut knew better. It knew that men like Robert Shaw do not send forward commands on expensive stationery for trivialities. I stepped inside. The cool air of the air-conditioned house washed over me. Sarah waved from the couch. Phone pressed to her ear, her smile bright and unburdened. I forced a smile back, a tight, brittle thing that felt like it might crack my face. I held up the mail and gestured vaguely toward my study, a universal signal for Dad has boring paperwork. She nodded, already engrossed in her conversation again. I closed the study door behind me, the solid oak clicking into place with a sound of finality. The room was my sanctuary, lined with books, smelling of old paper and leather. My desk was tidy. Now, this single sheet of paper lay in the center of the blotter, the four words screaming up at me from the silence. Call me immediately. I looked at my phone. It was just an object, black and inert. But calling that number felt like picking up a loaded gun. It felt like an action that could not be undone, a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. I could still walk away. I could crumple the note, toss in the shredder, and go back into the living room. I could ask Sarah about her day, make some dinner, watch a movie. I could choose to remain in the beautiful, ignorant bliss of 5 minutes ago. But I couldn't. The hook was in. Those 4 words were a question mark hanging over my entire existence. And I had to know what was on the other side. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over Robert's contact. I took a breath, the air tasting thin and insufficient. And I pressed call. I was about to learn that the weight I felt wasn't in the mail at all. It was the gravity of the truth pulling me in, and my life, as I knew it, was already over. A part of me was annoyed. It was a petty, superficial emotion, a life raft my mind clung to in the face of that stark 4-word command. Call me immediately. The audacity of it, the disruption. I was a man who scheduled his distractions. This was an unscheduled eruption. It was probably a billing discrepancy, I told myself, a furious internal monologue designed to smother the first whispers of panic. Robert's new paralegal had probably mixed up the accounts, charged me for a 3-hour conference call with some other poor soul named David, and now this dramatic note was the result. Or a forgotten signature, a document from the refinancing last fall, a single line I'd overlooked, now requiring a frantic last-minute notarization before some deadline passed. These things happened. In the ordered universe of a comfortable life, these were the typical crises. Annoying, time-consuming, but ultimately fixable. They were problems with solutions waiting in a manila folder. This stubborn, manufactured irritation was my shield as I stood there, the study door solid at my back, the phone heavy in my hand. I clung to it because the alternative was to acknowledge the chill that had settled in my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Lawyers like Robert Shaw did not deal in exclamation points. They dealt in footnotes and subclauses. For him to break protocol so blatantly meant the bedrock was cracking. And then the sound seeped through the door, diluting the silence, softening the sharp edges of my fear. It was the piano. Sarah. She was practicing, something she did most afternoons, a ritual as dependable as the sunset. The melody was a simple one, a beginner's piece by Bach, something she played 100 times since she was 10. The notes were clean, unhurried, a little mechanical in their repetition. A scale, a trill, a pause, then the same phrase again. It was the sound of diligence, of normalcy. It was the soundtrack of my life. I didn't open the door. I just stood there and listened, letting the simple, familiar tune wash over me. This was the calm before. I knew it with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute. This was the last moment my world would be this particular shape, possess this specific gravity. I was in the eye of the hurricane, and the fragile, sun-drenched peace was a lie. But it was a beautiful one. I could picture her so clearly, even through the wall. She'd be sitting on the polished bench, her back straight, her head tilted slightly as she read the sheet music. A stray strand of her honey-brown hair would have fallen across her face, and she'd be absently tucking it behind her ear with that specific, graceful gesture of hers. The light from the bay window would catch the dust motes dancing in the air around her. On the floor beside her, her school bag would be slumped open, a textbook spine cracked, a highlighter uncapped. There would be a half-empty glass of water on the coaster my wife had insisted on. Every detail was a stitch in the tapestry of our ordinary, perfect life. This was the life I had built. A life of piano practice and parent-teacher conferences. A life of grocery lists on the fridge and arguing over what to stream on a Friday night. A life where the biggest worry was her college application essay or a minor fender bender in the school parking lot. It was a life of small concerns and immense quiet joys. It was a fortress I had constructed brick by brick against the chaos of the world. And the sound of that piano, that simple, repetitive melody, was its national anthem. I thought of all the years that Melody scored. Her small, determined fingers fumbling the keys at her first recital. Her face a mask of concentration. Her playing it for her mother in the hospital room. A brave, shaky offering in a place filled with beeps and silence. Her using it as procrastination during finals week. The familiar notes a comfort against the stress of exams. It was the background music to our family story. It was the sound of everything I was about to lose. The annoyance had evaporated, leaving only a profound, aching sorrow for this version of my life, the one that was already receding into the past. I was a ghost in my own home, listening to the echoes of a world that was no longer mine. With that phone call, I was going to step out of this calm and into the storm. I was going to learn a truth that would make this memory, the image of my daughter at the piano, the simple notes hanging in the quiet air, unbearable. This was the last page of the first book of my life, and I was holding my breath, refusing to turn it. The melody came to its predictable, gentle conclusion. There was a moment of silence, then she began again from the top. The repetition was a promise of continuity, a promise I knew, in the deepest part of my soul, was about to be broken. I looked down at the phone. The screen had gone dark. I took a breath that felt like my first and my last, and I pressed the button to light it up again. The act of making the call felt like a series of deliberate, mechanical motions performed by someone else. My hand, seemingly autonomous, reached out and pushed the study door until the latch clicked into place, a sound as final as a judge's gavel. The room, my sanctuary of books and quiet thought, was now a sealed chamber. The afternoon light, once peaceful, now felt interrogatory, highlighting the dust on the shelves, the forgotten coffee mug, the single, damning sheet of paper on the desk. I picked up the phone. My thumb found Robert's name in the contacts. For a heart-stopping moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the call button like a man standing on a high ledge. This was the last second of my old life. I pressed it. He answered on the first ring. Not halfway through the first ring, but on it, as if his hand had been cupped around the receiver, waiting. There was no secretary, no hold music, no professional greeting. Just the connection clicking live, and then his voice. David. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement, heavy and grim. And in that one word, every fragile hope I'd constructed, the billing error, the forgotten signature, shattered into dust. His voice was strained, stripped of its usual polished cadence. It was a low, gravelly register, a tone I had only heard once before, years ago, during the fallout from a brutal, high-stakes corporate case that had nearly broken his firm. He had called me then. After it was over, his voice, similarly eroded by stress and lack of sleep, to tell me he was taking a month off to remember what quiet sounded like. This was that voice, but worse. This was the voice of a man standing in the ruins of something he thought was fireproof. There was no small talk. No, how are you? No, sorry for the abrupt note. The social contract of polite conversation had been voided. I need you to listen very carefully, he said, each word measured and deliberate, as if he were laying stones on a grave. Do not interrupt me. Do not ask questions until I am finished. What I am about to tell you is not a theory. It is not a suspicion. It is a confirmed fact built on a paper trail and digital forensics. Your primary task, right now, is to control your reaction, your face, your breathing, your voice. Do you understand? Yes. I managed the word dry croak. Good. A pause, and I could hear him take a sharp breath, steeling himself. Do not react. And David, for God's sake, do not say her name out loud. A fresh, icier wave of dread washed over me. Do not say her name. It was the ultimate severance. It transformed her from my daughter, a person with a face and a history and a melody she played on the piano, into a subject, a problem, a security risk. The simple, beautiful name, Sarah, was now a classified secret, a word too dangerous to be spoken in the open air of my own home. I could still hear the faint, muffled sounds of her moving around in the living room, the floorboards creaking under her feet. She was just beyond the door, living her life, completely unaware that on this side of the wood, she was being discussed in the hushed, clinical tones of a crisis. I'm listening, I whispered, turning my back to the door, as if that would somehow contain the conversation, prevent it from leaking out. What followed was not yet the truth, but the architecture of it. He began to lay the foundation, and it was made of cold, hard, impersonal data. He spoke of a routine financial audit tied to a small educational trust her grandmother had left her. A simple verification process, but the numbers hadn't matched. A deposit sizable, from a source that didn't align with any known employment. Then another. He spoke of anomalies in digital footprints. He used terms like shell corporation and layering and untraceable assets, words I associated with crime dramas and newspaper headlines about fallen financiers, not with my daughter's college savings account. His voice was a relentless, low drone, painting a picture in shades of gray and black. He wasn't telling me a story about a person. He was describing the schematic of a machine, a complex, hidden apparatus that was operating with chilling efficiency. And at the center of this machine was the ghost of my child. The girl who loved strawberry ice cream and argued with me about movie plots was being systematically erased and replaced by this phantom, an entity of transactions and aliases, of secret post office boxes and encrypted communications. All the while, his initial warning echoed in my head, "Don't react. Don't say her name." So I stood there, a statue of man, the phone pressed so hard against my ear it ached. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry out. I didn't scream. I just listened, my eyes fixed on a single, worn leather-bound book on my shelf, seeing nothing. The world outside this room, the world of piano music and cut grass, ceased to exist. There was only Robert's voice, laying brick after brick of this terrible, invisible wall between me and my daughter, a wall I now had to pretend didn't exist the moment I walked back through that door. He began to lay out the facts, and his voice changed. The initial strain, the grave urgency, was now overlaid with a cold, methodical precision. This was Robert the architect, Robert the engineer, deconstructing a complex and malevolent machine. He was no longer just my friend delivering bad news. He was a forensic accountant, a digital pathologist, and he was conducting an autopsy on my daughter's secret life. It started with the Henderson Scholarship. He began, his tone flat, devoid of inflection. The routine background check. Simple, harmless. They outsourced to a third-party firm for due diligence. Standard credit pull, academic verification, social media scan. I remember the scholarship. We've been so proud. A prestigious, merit-based award for students pursuing economics. She'd spent weeks on the essay. We'd celebrated with a fancy dinner when she got the finalist notification. That dinner, her face glowing with achievement, felt like a scene from someone else's life now. A play I had mistakenly believed was real. The first flag was minor, Robert continued. An address discrepancy. The scholarship application listed her campus dormitory. But a secondary, deeper financial review, the kind they do for the top-tier awards, picked up a P.O. box in Crestview, registered in her name. Crestview, a town 40 miles away, a place we had no connection to, a place she had never, to my knowledge, even visited. I thought it was an error, a clerical mistake. I made a discreet inquiry, just to clear it up before it jeopardized the award. He paused, and I could almost hear him assembling the next piece of evidence. That was a thread, David, and when I pulled it, the entire tapestry began to unravel. The deeper he dug, he explained, the more the digital footprints diverged, splitting like a forked tongue. The story she told us, the one we lived inside, was a beautifully crafted fiction, so seamless in detail we never thought to question its walls. Her story was study groups at the Miller Library, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 7 to 10 p.m., Robert stated. Cell phone location data places her phone there. Consistently. But the digital access log for the library's Wi-Fi network show her student login was used remotely during those times, from an IP address registered to a commercial internet service in Crestview. Her phone was left in a locker, David, or with accomplice. A deliberate, calculated decoy. The air left my lungs. A decoy. The word was so cold, so clinical. It implied planning, espionage. It wasn't a kid skipping class. It was a spy establishing an alibi. The part-time job at the campus bookstore, he went on, his voice relentless. The one she said she worked Wednesday afternoons and Saturdays. Payroll exists. Her deposits into her joint account with you match the pay stubs. But the security camera footage from the employee entrance, pulled for a random sampling of those days, shows her badge being swiped, but the person under the hoodie, the one who keeps their head down, is not her. It's a different woman, similar build, same hair color. She's paying a stand-in. My mind recoiled. A stand-in? How? Why? The logistics, the coordination, the sheer paranoid effort of it all was staggering. This wasn't a double life born of a single mistake. This was an enterprise. The fiction was airtight, Robert said, a hint of grim admiration in his tone. The library logs, the payroll deposits, the text messages she'd send you mid-study session complaining about a boring textbook. It was all part of the narrative. She was managing two realities simultaneously. The one for you and the one for them. Them. The word hung in the silence, vast and terrifying. It was no longer an abstract concept. There was a them. There were accomplices, stand-ins, a network. She told you she was saving for a car. He continued, delivering the next blow. And she was depositing a couple $100s a month from her bookstore job into her savings account. A believable, modest amount. But that was the pocket change. The real money, the substantial sums, were flowing into the Crestview P.O. Box account. Thousands at a time. From sources my preliminary search has been unable to trace. It's clean, digital currency, washed through layers of dummy corporations before it ever reaches her. He let that sink in. The story we believed was the cover for a darker, more complex truth hiding in plain sight. The good grades, the scholarship application, the part-time job, they weren't just achievements. They were the perfect camouflage. They painted the picture of a responsible, ambitious young woman, the last person anyone would suspect of leading a sophisticated, secret financial life. The perfect alibi is not an absence of activity, but a presence of impeccable, verifiable activity. She hadn't just lied to us. She had constructed a fortress of lies, and we, her loving parents, had been the proud, oblivious guards at the gate, never thinking to look inside. The truth wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was masquerading as the light. The facts Robert laid out were no longer just disparate threads of deception. They began to weave together, forming a fabric so dark and intricate it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, suffocating the last of my breath. He had moved beyond uncovering lies. He had uncovered a whole other person. David, he said, his voice dropping even lower, as if the walls themselves might be complicit. She didn't just lie. She replicated. The word felt alien, terrifying. Replicated. I have in my possession documentation for a separate social security number. He stated, each word a hammer blow. It's not a forgery. It's a genuine, government-issued number, issued to a Catherine Miller. Date of birth matches Sarah's. Place of birth is listed as Crestview General, not St. Jude's where she was actually born. I felt the room tilt. A social security number. It was the cornerstone of an identity. It was the key that unlocked everything else. Bank accounts, credit, a legitimate existence in the eyes of the state. She hadn't just stolen an identity. She had built one from the ground up, brick by bureaucratic brick, with her own face and her own fingerprints, but with a different soul. Catherine Miller. The name echoed in my head, a ghost haunting the space where my daughter's name used to be. This Catherine Miller rents a small, furnished apartment above a laundromat in Crestview. He continued, his narrative painting a picture of a life I could never have imagined. Paid for in cash, 6 months in advance. The lease is signed. The utilities are in her name. Her name. The landlord described her as a quiet, serious student who kept to herself. He said she received a lot of packages. Packages. The word was so mundane, yet in this context, it felt sinister. What was in them? Textbooks for a major she wasn't enrolled in? Clothes for a personality she only wore in that town? Or something else entirely? The P.O. box was just the mailing address, Robert explained. The apartment is the operational base. It's where Catherine Miller lives. She has a bank account there at a local credit union. The statements, which I have subpoenaed, show a history of transactions that make no sense for a college student. Not for a college student, anyway. He began to list them, and each item was a fresh fracture in my understanding of the world. Large, regular deposits of untraceable digital currency, Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies converted into cash. Withdrawals of precise odd amounts for $1,750, $8,300. Not round numbers. Numbers that suggested fees, percentages, payments for services rendered. There are wire transfers to corporate entities registered in offshore havens, he said. Bills paid for a corporate cell phone plan with a dozen lines. Receipts for high-end computer equipment, not for gaming, but for data processing. For server space. There are monthly retainers paid to a law firm in Delaware I've never heard of and to a private security consultancy based in Switzerland. I leaned forward, my forehead pressing against the cool, polished wood of my desk. Switzerland. Offshore havens. Private security. These are the words of a geopolitical thriller, not the life of my little girl. This wasn't a teenager dabbling in something foolish. This was an operation, a business. Catherine Miller was not a persona for sneaking out to parties or hiding a boyfriend. Catherine Miller was a CEO, a spy master, a ghost in the machine of international finance, and God knew what else. The quiet, obedient girl in your living room, Robert said, and for the first time, his voice cracked with a sliver of emotion that sounded like pity, is a stranger. She is a tenant in Crestview. She is a signatory on offshore accounts. She is the client of Swiss security firms. This Sarah, you know, is the performance. Catherine is the reality. The chasm between those two names felt infinite. I thought of her sitting at our dinner table just last night, complaining about her political science professor, eating her spaghetti with the same focus she'd had since she was 6. Was that all an act? A carefully rehearsed scene performed by Catherine Miller, who had just flown in from a meeting with her lawyers in Delaware. The sheer mental energy required to maintain such a division was incomprehensible. It was the work of a brilliant, fractured psyche, a mind capable of building a fortress around its true self and then living full-time in the meticulously maintained facade outside its walls. He had built a parallel existence. Robert was right. It wasn't a double life in the sense of having a secret. It was a parallel existence, a universe running alongside ours, touching it at points for sustenance and cover, but operating under entirely different physical and moral laws. In our universe, she was a daughter, a student, a pianist. In the Crestview universe, she was Catherine Miller, an entity of transaction and shadow, a node in a network that spanned beyond my comprehension. And the most terrifying thought of all was that Catherine Miller had been living in our house, sleeping in her childhood bed, for years, and we had never once seen her. We had only ever seen the ghost she sent to play the part. The architecture of the lie was complete. Robert had laid out the blueprints of this second life, this parallel existence of Catherine Miller with her sterile apartment and her cryptic financial statements. But a blueprint is not the building. The terrible truth was the building itself, and he had been walking me through its empty, echoing halls, saving the final, horrifying room for last. The room where the purpose of the machine was revealed. He took a breath, a sharp, ragged intake of air that was loud in the silent connection between us. It was the sound of a man steeling himself to commit an act of violence, because that is what the truth was in that moment, a brutal, shattering violence against my soul. David, he began, his voice now stripped bare of all its professional veneer. It was raw, exhausted, final. The money from the bookstore, the deposits she let you see, that was set dressing. Ah, prop. The real money, the millions. Million. The word detonated in the quiet study. It wasn't thousands. It was millions. It isn't from a part-time job. It isn't from any job a 19-year-old should have. He finally said it. The words were no longer about data points and digital footprints. They were about action. They were about sin. The late nights she told you were for studying, the library sessions, that was her operational window. That's when Catherine Miller went to work. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Operational window. The phrase was so cold, so mercenary. She is deeply entangled, David. He paused, letting the euphemism hang in the air before crushing it. And not as a victim, not as some coerced mule or a naive girl in overhead. She is a participant, a willing integral, and for what I can piece together, a founding participant. A founding participant. My daughter. The girl I taught to ride a bicycle. A founder. She is the central link, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the walls themselves were now enemies. The architect of the digital framework. She's not running drugs or moving stolen goods. It's more sophisticated than that. It's the kind of operation you read about in the financial section of the newspaper and your eyes glaze over because it's too complex. And you shake your head, grateful it's not your family. Grateful it's just faceless criminals in a foreign country defrauding pensions or laundering money for regimes you can't find on a map. Each word was a physical blow. I braced myself against the desk, my knuckles white. I could see those articles. I had read them. I had shaken my head with that vague, distant pity for the anonymous victims. I had never once imagined the engine of such a thing could be built and maintained in the room down the hall by the child I had raised. She built the platform, Robert said, and there was a terrifying hint of awe in his horror. The one the FBI and the SEC have been trying to untangle for 2 years. They have code names for it. The Hydra, the Maze. It's a decentralized, encrypted marketplace and laundering conduit. It's a ghost in the machine. And the machine is breaking the law on a scale I can barely quantify. He began to list the charges, not as suspicions, but as facts he had corroborated. Securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering. The words were like stones being piled on my chest, each one heavier than the last, crushing the air from my lungs. These were not misdemeanors. These were federal crimes with sentences measured in decades. Life sentences. My little girl was a ghost in the machine. The thought formed, not as words, but as a pure, agonizing wave of understanding. She wasn't just using the machine, she was the machine. Her brilliance, the sharp, analytical mind that had so effortlessly mastered calculus and complex systems, the same mind I had admired and nurtured, that mind had designed this digital monster. She had used her gifts not to build, but to create a labyrinthine fortress for crime. The piano-playing fingers had typed the code. The brain that could memorize sonatas had architected encryption protocols meant to baffle the world's best cyber-forensic teams. The terrible truth was not just that she was a criminal. It was the scale. It was the cold, calculated, premeditated genius of it. It was the realization that the values I thought I had instilled in her, honesty, integrity, empathy, were either never there, or they had been surgically removed and replaced with this void. This hunger for something that made millions of dollars and the ruination of anonymous victims a worthwhile trade for a soul. Robert fell silent. The recitation was over. There was nothing more to say. The truth was now a vast, desolate landscape inside me, and I was standing alone in the center of it. The law had names for what she had done, but it had no name for what I was feeling, the cataclysmic collapse of a father's universe, the utter and complete annihilation of the man I was just half an hour ago, when the mail was just mail and the piano was just a piano. The click of the phone ending the call was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a universe ending. For a long moment, I did not move. I was a fossil encased in the amber of that terrible, final silence. The facts, the charges, the millions, they were a storm of shrapnel still whirling inside my skull. And if I moved, I feared they would tear their way out. Slowly, carefully, as if my body were made of cracked glass, I stood up. My legs were numb, distant things, refusing the familiar signals from my brain. They were the legs of a man who had just learned he had been living a lie, and they had forgotten how to carry the weight of it. I took a step, then another, a marionette pulled by an invisible, agonizing string toward the window. The world outside was a postcard of suburban tranquility. The same world I had looked upon 10 minutes ago, but now it was a painted backdrop, a cheap prop. The sun was lower, casting the street in a warm, golden, mocking light. A neighbor watered his petunias. A kid on a bicycle weaved down the sidewalk, no hands. The oak tree at the end of the drive stood, steadfast and stupid in its ignorance. Everything was the same. That was the cruelty of it. The world had not ended. Only mine had. And then I saw her. Not directly, but reflected in the darkening glass of the window. A ghost superimposed upon the scene of a perfect, ordinary street. She was still at the piano, her silhouette framed perfectly by the living room archway. Her fingers moved over the keys with a fluid, practiced grace. The same fingers that, according to Robert, had typed the code for the Hydra. The same mind that was effortlessly interpreting the complex patterns of Bach was the one that had architected a labyrinth for criminals. I stared at the reflection. It was her. Every contour of her face, the slope of her shoulders, the way she tucked her hair. It was my Sarah, the child I had held in my arms the moment she was born. The girl I had taught to read, to ride a bike, to drive a car. I knew the sound of her laughter, the specific scent of her shampoo, the way she crinkled her nose when she was thinking. I knew her. I had built my life around knowing her. But I didn't. The thought did not arrive as a shout, but as a quiet, absolute certainty that filled the hollowed-out space inside me. How could the person I loved most in this world, the person whose well-being was the central organizing principle of my entire adult life, be a complete and total stranger? The reflection in the glass was a photograph of someone who no longer existed, if she ever had. The real person was Catherine Miller, a founder, a criminal mastermind, a tenant in a dusty apartment above a laundromat. The trust one had built over a lifetime. Not just my trust in her, but the very concept of trust itself, shattered in that single, crystalline moment. It wasn't a crack. It was a pulverization. Every memory was now suspect. Every hug, every shared secret, every "I love you, Dad." Were they all part of the performance? Was her childhood a long con? Had she ever been real? Or was she always a vessel waiting to be filled by this other, terrifying persona? The foundation of my identity as a father, as a protector, as a guide, crumbled into dust. I had failed on a cosmic scale. I had nurtured a wolf in sheep's clothing and never once sensed the predator beneath the fleece. The reflection moved, her head tilting as she reached the end of a movement. She was so close. I could have opened the door, walked 10 paces, and touched her. But the distance between us was now infinite. It was the distance between a father and a stranger, between a home and a crime scene, between love and a profound, terrifying grief for someone who was still breathing. The trust was gone. What was left in its place was a vast, howling emptiness and the chilling, procedural knowledge of what I had to do next. The man in the reflection, the one with the pale, haunted face staring back at me from the glass, he was a stranger too. The call had killed us both. The girl at the piano was a ghost, and the father watching her was her shadow. We were just two echoes, lingering in the shell of the house that was no longer a home. The reflection was a trap, a siren song of normalcy begging me to stay frozen in this liminal space, where the truth was a nightmare contained within 4 walls, and the outside world was still a beautiful, ignorant lie. But the call had ended. The knowledge was inside me now, a radioactive core poisoning my blood, my bones, my every thought. I could not remain a spectator at the window. I had to enter the stage. I had to turn around. The command was simple, a fundamental motor function, yet it felt like being asked to will my own heart to stop. My body resisted, a leaden statue refusing the sculptor's chisel. The muscles in my neck and shoulders were locked, holding me in position, forcing me to watch the ghost girl finish her piece. The final notes of the Bach melody hung in the air, a question without an answer, and then faded into a silence that was louder than any sound. This was it. The performance was over. The curtain was about to come down, not with a graceful sweep, but with a violent, splintering crash. I had to open the study door. My hand rose, moving as if through a viscous fluid. It found a cool brass knob. This simple piece of hardware, polished to a shine by years of use, was now the barrier between 2 universes. On my side, the crushing, silent knowledge of ruin. On the other side, the last few seconds of a world that still believed in itself. I turned the knob. The mechanism clicked, a sound as sharp and final as a gunshot in a quiet house. The seal was broken. The sanctity of my study, the tomb where my old self had just been buried, was violated. The realities were about to collide. I had to walk back into the living room. The 10 paces from the study door to the edge of the Persian rug in the living room were the longest journey of my life. Each step was a lifetime. With the first step, I was the father coming to ask his daughter about her day. With the second, I was a warden approaching a prisoner. With the third, I was an investigator confronting a subject. With the fourth, I was a victim facing his betrayer. My legs, no longer numb, were now filled with a painful, electric awareness of every fiber, every tendon, screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to preserve this one last moment of peace. She was still on the piano bench, her back to me, humming softly, idly pressing a single key, the note repeating like a slow, dying heartbeat. The evening sun caught the dust motes dancing around her, a halo of insignificance around a monument of deception. I could see the familiar landscape of the room, the family photos on the mantel, the slight wear on the arm of the sofa, the book she had been reading left open on the coffee table. A museum of a life that was a lie. I would have to look into her eyes. She must have sensed my presence, the weight of my gaze, or perhaps the sheer, tectonic force of my shattered soul shifting behind her. The humming stopped. The single, repeated notes ceased. She began to turn. It was a slow, graceful pivot, the same motion I'd seen 1,000 times when I called her for dinner or to answer the phone. But this time, it was in slow motion, a horror unfolding frame by frame. First, the profile, the straight nose, the curve of her cheek. Then the full face. And finally the eyes. The same eyes I had watched take their first look at this world, wide and blue and full of an ancient, unknowable wisdom. The same eyes that had sparkled with laughter, welled with tears over a scraped knee, narrowed in concentration over a math problem. They were the windows to a soul I thought I knew. Now, they were just windows into a house where a stranger lived. I would have to speak. My throat was a desert of ash. My tongue was a foreign object, thick and useless. Robert's warning, "Don't say her name," echoed, but it was too late. The name was the key. To speak, it was to unlock the door between the father and the stranger. To begin the end, I would have to say her name. My lips parted. The air rasped in my throat. The name, the beautiful, simple name that had been a prayer on my lips for 19 years, now felt like a curse. Sarah. The word came out, not as a father's gentle call, but as a dry, broken thing stripped of all love, all warmth. It was an accusation, a verdict. Her expression shifted. The soft, post-practice languor evaporated. She saw my face. She saw the abyss in my eyes. She saw the corpse of the trust that had lived between us, and she knew. The performance was over. The mask, for a fleeting second, slipped, and in her eyes I saw not my daughter, but a flash of Catherine Miller, calculating, cold, and cornered. It was there and gone, replaced by a wary, guarded confusion. Dad? What's wrong? This was the end of everything I knew. The perfect illusion of our lives was gone, replaced by the terrifying, raw truth of what we had become. The conversation that was about to begin would be the first of the rest of our lives, a life sentence in a prison of our own making. And it was just the beginning.